The Linda Kozlowski obsession, Paul Hogan's decade of delusion. In the annals of celebrity obsession, few stories are as devastating and pathetic as Paul Hogan's 10-year descent into madness following his divorce from Linda Kozlowski. What began as a marriage that had already cost him everything would transform into something far more disturbing. A psychological spiral that consumed his final years, destroyed his remaining relationships, and reduced a once powerful man to a hollow shell haunted by fantasies of a woman who had moved on completely. This is the brutal examination of how love can become sickness, how devotion can transform into delusion, and how a man's inability to accept rejection can poison every remaining moment of his life. Paul's obsession with Linda wasn't romantic love. It was the pathological fixation of someone who had built his entire identity around a relationship that existed primarily in his imagination. From his daily morning vigils searching the horizon for Linda's return to his compulsive destruction of their correspondence, to his complete refusal to form new relationships with anyone else, Paul's post-divorce behavior revealed the disturbing psychology of a man who had confused possession with love and control with devotion. Most shocking of all, this obsession wasn't a brief period of grief that gradually healed. It was a decade-long descent into a delusional state that consumed his health, isolated him from his family, and transformed him from a global icon into a pathetic figure trapped in a prison of his own making. While Linda built a new life of freedom and happiness in Morocco, Paul remained frozen in time, clinging to memories of a relationship that may never have been real in the first place. This is the disturbing truth about what happens when celebrity narcissism meets psychological breakdown. When a man who spent decades controlling his public image loses all control over his private demons, and when the inability to let go becomes a form of emotional terrorism that destroys everything it claims to protect. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Delusion. Paul Hogan's obsession with Linda Kozlowski didn't begin with their divorce in 2014. It had been building throughout their marriage as Paul gradually confused his romantic idealization of Linda with the reality of who she actually was as a person. By the time their relationship ended, Paul had constructed such an elaborate fantasy about their connection that he became psychologically incapable of accepting that it was over. "I still think about her every day. Sometimes I wonder if I had changed a little, would she have stayed?" Paul admitted in a rare moment of vulnerability, but this confession revealed the fundamental delusion that would consume his remaining year. He believed that their relationship had failed because of his inadequacies rather than accepting that Linda had simply chosen a different life that didn't include him. The foundation of Paul's obsession was his inability to distinguish between the character of Sue Charlton that Linda had played in Crocodile Dundee and Linda's actual personality and aspirations. Perhaps Paul himself never truly loved the real Linda. He became infatuated with the image of Sue Charlton. Gentle, clever, graceful. A character crafted from the film script, revealing how Paul's romantic feelings were based on a fictional creation rather than authentic understanding of the woman he claimed to love. Paul mistook that for Linda's true nature, mistaken that he had found a soulmate in the vast and lonely world of Hollywood. But in reality, perhaps he had only fallen for a role that freed him from the monotony and loneliness of middle age, demonstrating how Paul's obsession was fundamentally narcissistic. It was about what Linda represented for his self-image rather than genuine appreciation for her as an independent person with her own goals and desire. The marriage itself had become a performance where Paul cast Linda in the role of devoted wife and cultural companion, while Linda increasingly felt trapped in a character she had never chosen to play in real life. Linda felt imprisoned. From the outside it looked like she had everything, but in reality she had lost herself, but Paul was incapable of recognizing her unhappiness because it contradicted the fantasy relationship he had constructed in his mind. When Linda finally filed for divorce, Paul's reaction revealed the depth of his delusion about what their marriage had actually been. Paul, now in his 70s, with silver hair and a frail body weakened by a cruel muscle condition, no longer had the strength to resist or fight for anything. Facing the divorce papers, he did not argue, did not demand assets, but his passive acceptance wasn't dignity. It was the behavior of someone who couldn't process that his fantasy was being definitively shattered. The only things he wished to keep, memories and love, had broken long ago. But Paul's understanding of what constituted love was so distorted that he couldn't recognize that holding on to memories of a relationship that had caused both parties such pain was not loving, but obsessive and destructive. The elaborate mythology that Paul had constructed around his relationship with Linda required him to reinterpret every sign of her unhappiness as temporary difficulty that could be overcome with patience and devotion, rather than recognizing clear indicators that she wanted a fundamentally different life than the one he was offering. Paul's identity had become so intertwined with his role as Linda's husband that losing that relationship meant losing his understanding of who he was as a person. Rather than developing a new identity based on his actual circumstances and opportunities, he chose to preserve his fantasy by refusing to accept that the relationship was truly over. The psychological defense mechanisms that Paul employed to protect his delusion included minimizing Linda's expressions of dissatisfaction, reinterpreting her departure as temporary separation rather than permanent choice, and constructing elaborate scenarios in which she might return if he just waited long enough or changed in the right way. Most dangerously, Paul's obsession required him to maintain emotional and psychological investment in someone who had clearly communicated through her actions that she wanted no further connection with him. This transformation of love into harassment would define his remaining years and poison every other relationship he might have developed. The tragedy of Paul's delusion was that it prevented him from finding peace, acceptance, and new sources of meaning and connection during the final years of his life. Instead of using his remaining time for personal growth, family relationships, or creative fulfillment, he chose to remain trapped in a fantasy that grew more pathological with each passing year. Chapter 2: The Daily Rituals of a Broken Man. Paul Hogan's obsession with Linda Kozlowski manifested in a series of compulsive daily behaviors that revealed the depth of his psychological deterioration and his complete inability to accept the reality of their divorce. These rituals transformed his Venice Beach home from a place of residence into a shrine to his delusions, where every room became a stage for acting out scenarios that existed only in his diseased imagination. Friends said he still kept the habit of sitting on the second-floor balcony every morning, looking out at the sea as if searching for Linda's figure among the breaking waves, revealing the most disturbing of Paul's daily obsession. This wasn't casual reminiscence or healthy grieving. This was the compulsive behavior of someone who had convinced himself that Linda might magically reappear if he just maintained his vigilant watch long enough. The morning vigil became the cornerstone of Paul's daily routine, consuming hours that could have been spent on productive activities or healing relationships. Instead, he chose to position himself where he could scan the horizon for a woman who was thousands of miles away, building a new life that deliberately excluded him from any consideration or contact. Sometimes people caught sight of Paul quietly tearing old letters or smiling faintly at old photographs, simple moments that had become nothing more than memory. But these weren't healthy acts of closure. They were compulsive behaviors that revealed Paul's inability to either preserve or release his connection to Linda in any psychologically healthy way. The destruction of correspondence wasn't cathartic release but obsessive re-engagement with painful reminders of Linda's departure. Paul would tear up letters only to piece them back together, destroy photographs only to search for replacements, creating cycles of symbolic destruction and restoration that mirrored his inability to let go of the relationship itself. Paul's interaction with photographs of Linda became particularly disturbing, as he would alternate between smiling at images that reminded him of happier times and becoming angry at pictures that reminded him of her independence and strength. This emotional volatility around visual reminders revealed someone whose mental state was increasingly unstable and unpredictable. The house itself became a mausoleum where Paul preserved artifacts of his marriage while simultaneously attempting to erase evidence of Linda's rejection of that relationship. Rooms were maintained exactly as Linda had left them, while other spaces were stripped of anything that reminded him of her autonomy or displeasure with their life together. The house now felt vast and empty, the sound of waves crashing against the shore, echoing fragments of memory. But Paul chose to interpret this emptiness as romantic longing rather than recognizing it as the natural consequence of his refusal to build new relationships or find new sources of meaning and purpose in his life. The isolation that Paul maintained wasn't peaceful solitude but aggressive rejection of any external reality that might challenge his obsessive focus on Linda. He refused social invitations, avoided professional opportunities, and minimized contact with family members who might encourage him to move forward with his life. He refused every introduction, every possibility of new affection, demonstrating that Paul's devotion to Linda had become a form of psychological violence against himself and anyone who tried to help him develop healthier relationships or find alternative sources of companionship and support. Paul's daily routine became structured around maintaining his obsession rather than promoting his health, happiness, or personal growth. Meals were eaten in rooms where he and Linda had shared meals, walks were taken on beaches where they had walked together, and television programs were watched based on whether they reminded him of shows they had enjoyed during their marriage. The conversations that Paul had with visitors increasingly focused on analysis of his relationship with Linda, speculation about her current life, and elaborate theories about what he could have done differently to prevent the divorce. These discussions revealed someone whose mental energy was completely consumed by rumination rather than present moment awareness or future planning. Most disturbing was Paul's transformation of ordinary household activities into rituals of obsession. Making coffee became an opportunity to remember Linda's morning preferences, gardening became a chance to maintain plants she had chosen, and even basic maintenance tasks became exercises in preserving a domestic environment that no longer existed except in his imagination. The cumulative effect of these daily obsessive behaviors was to create a psychological prison where Paul's entire existence revolved around maintaining connection to someone who had explicitly chosen to end their relationship and build a new life without him. Each ritual reinforced his delusion while preventing the acceptance and adaptation that might have allowed him to find peace and meaning in his actual circumstances. Chapter 3: The Shrine to Impossible Dreams. The Venice Beach house that Paul Hogan continued to inhabit after Linda Kozlowski's departure became far more than a residence. It was transformed into a disturbing shrine where every room told a different story of Paul's psychological breakdown and his inability to distinguish between preserving memories and maintaining delusions about a relationship that had ended both legally and emotionally. The Venice Beach house was no longer a home, just a place where he confined himself with memories he could never erase. But this characterization understates the pathological nature of what Paul had created. This wasn't simply a house filled with nostalgic reminders, it was a carefully curated museum of obsession where Paul could maintain the illusion that his relationship with Linda might resume at any moment. The second-floor balcony where Paul conducted his morning vigils was arranged like a watchtower, with chairs positioned to maximize his view of the ocean and binoculars placed within easy reach for closer examination of any female figures who might appear on the distant shore. This wasn't casual observation but systematic surveillance of his environment in pursuit of fantasies that had no basis in reality. He felt lost looking at the wedding photos from Beverly Hills, the once happy videos now distant memories. But Paul's interaction with visual records of his marriage revealed disturbing patterns of selective editing and reinterpretation. He had removed or hidden any images that showed Linda looking uncomfortable, unhappy, or independent, creating a visual narrative that supported his delusion rather than reflecting the complex reality of their relationship. The bedroom that Paul and Linda had shared was preserved exactly as it had been on the day she left, with Linda's personal items arranged as if she might return at any moment to reclaim them. This wasn't romantic sentimentality but psychological dysfunction. Paul was maintaining a domestic environment that denied the reality of Linda's departure and choice to build a new life elsewhere. The kitchen became a particularly disturbing space where Paul continued to prepare meals for two people, setting Linda's place at the table and cooking foods that had been her favorites during their marriage. When these meals went uneaten, Paul would consume both portions himself while imagining conversations they might have had about their shared day. Night after night, it was only him in the shadow on the wall with questions no one could answer, revealing how Paul had begun talking to Linda's absence as if her presence could be maintained through sheer force of will and verbal engagement with empty spaces where she had once existed. The living room was arranged around a collection of Linda's abandoned belongings that Paul treated as sacred relics rather than forgotten items that someone had chosen not to take when they moved to a new life. Books she had read, clothes she had worn, and decorative objects she had chosen became objects of veneration that Paul would handle while imagining her thoughts and feelings when she had interacted with them. The garage and storage spaces became repositories for items that Paul couldn't bear to discard but also couldn't display without confronting the painful reality that Linda had chosen to leave them behind. Boxes of correspondence, gifts from their marriage, and travel mementos from their shared experiences were maintained in careful organization as if they constituted evidence that might eventually prove the authenticity of feelings that Linda had clearly determined were insufficient to sustain their relationship. The garden areas around the house were maintained according to Linda's preferences rather than Paul's own aesthetic choices or practical needs. Plants she had chosen continued to be cared for as if they were living connections to her presence, while new growth was discouraged because it might alter the landscape she had known and potentially loved. I gave up an entire lifetime only to end up living like a shadow in my own home. Paul reflected about his current existence, but this wasn't tragic resignation. It was the logical outcome of choosing to live in a shrine to impossible dreams rather than adapting his environment to support his actual circumstances and opportunities for continued growth and relationship. The technologies that Paul employed to maintain his shrine included security cameras that allowed him to monitor approaches to the house in case Linda decided to return, phone systems that preserved her voicemail messages, and internet searches that provided regular updates about her new life that he consumed obsessively while convincing himself that her apparent happiness in Morocco was temporary and that she would eventually recognize her mistake in leaving him. The financial resources that Paul devoted to maintaining his shrine revealed the extent to which his obsession had become economically destructive. Rather than downsizing to a more manageable residence or investing in experiences that might provide new sources of meaning and connection, he continued to pour money into preserving a domestic environment that served no constructive purpose except feeding his delusions about Linda's eventual return. Chapter 4. The Pathology of Waiting. Paul Hogan's post-divorce existence became defined by a form of psychological suspended animation where every decision was made in anticipation of Linda Kozlowski's return, creating a life structure so rigidly focused on impossible reunion that it prevented any form of personal growth, emotional healing, or adaptation to his actual circumstances as a divorced man in his 70s. Paul once believed that with patience everything would return to the way it was, but the more he waited, the more painful it became to realize that there was no way back, capturing the fundamental delusion that structured Paul's entire approach to his post-Linda existence. This wasn't healthy hope or reasonable expectation. It was pathological denial of clear evidence that Linda had chosen a different life with no intention of reuniting with someone she had explicitly rejected through legal divorce proceeding. The waiting itself became compulsive behavior that consumed psychological energy that could have been directed toward building new relationships, pursuing creative projects, or finding alternative sources of meaning and purpose during his final years. Instead, Paul chose to remain psychologically frozen at the moment of Linda's departure, unable to move forward because doing so would require accepting that she was never coming back. Since the day Linda left, Paul Hogan never opened his heart to anyone else. He accepted a life alone, but this wasn't noble devotion or romantic fidelity. It was the pathological behavior of someone who had made his entire identity dependent on a relationship that no longer existed except in his imagination. Paul's refusal to consider new romantic connections wasn't loyalty to Linda but betrayal of his own psychological health and social needs. The elaborate scenarios that Paul constructed in his mind about Linda's eventual return revealed the depth of his detachment from reality. He imagined that her new life in Morocco was temporary rebellion against their marriage, that her relationship with another man was calculated to make him jealous, and that she was waiting for him to demonstrate sufficient change to warrant giving their relationship another chance. I still think about her every day. Sometimes I wonder if I had changed a little, would she have stayed? Demonstrating Paul's transformation of Linda's clear rejection into evidence that reunion remained possible if he could just identify and correct whatever behaviors or characteristics had driven her away. This thinking pattern prevented acceptance of divorce as final decision and maintained obsessive focus on impossible reconciliation. The daily routine that Paul established around his waiting revealed someone whose entire schedule was organized around maintaining readiness for Linda's return, rather than building a satisfying life as a single person. He maintained their shared home exactly as Linda had known it, preserved routines they had shared, and avoided any changes that might suggest acceptance of her permanent absence. The social isolation that resulted from Paul's waiting wasn't protective of his privacy, but destructive of his mental health and emotional stability. By refusing to develop new friendships or maintain existing relationships that might challenge his obsession with Linda, Paul created an echo chamber where his delusions could flourish without reality testing or external perspective. Even with being a national icon of Australia with a fortune exceeding $20 million, Paul Hogan could not fill the void of loneliness within his heart. But this loneliness was self-imposed through his choice to interpret Linda's absence as temporary separation rather than permanent conclusion of their relationship. Paul's resources could have supported rich social life and meaningful activities if he had been psychologically capable of accepting his new circumstances. The conversations that Paul had with himself during his waiting periods revealed internal dialogue focused on analyzing past interactions with Linda, imagining future reunion scenario, and constructing elaborate justifications for why she might eventually choose to return to someone she had already rejected definitively through divorce proceeding. The physical health deterioration that accompanied Paul's psychological fixation on waiting demonstrated how obsessive behavior can manifest in bodily symptoms and declining self-care. Rather than maintaining his health to support active engagement with life opportunities, Paul allowed himself to decay while waiting for someone who would never return. Paul developed muscle atrophy, his arms weakened, his steps slowed. But the deepest pain was not physical, it was emotional, revealing how Paul's refusal to accept Linda's departure had created suffering that encompassed every aspect of his existence, while serving no constructive purpose except maintaining connection to impossible fantasy. The tragedy of Paul's pathological waiting was that it consumed the remaining years of his life without providing any form of satisfaction, growth, or peace. While Linda built a new life of freedom and authentic happiness, Paul remained trapped in a temporal prison of his own making, unable to move forward because he had confused waiting for someone with loving them. Chapter 5: The Deliberate Destruction of New Possibilities. Paul Hogan's obsession with Linda Kozlowski required him to systematically sabotage every opportunity for new relationships, creative project, or personal growth that might threaten his psychological fixation on impossible reunion with someone who had clearly communicated her intention never to return to him. This wasn't passive neglect of opportunities, but active destruction of possibilities that might have provided meaning and connection during his final years. He refused every introduction, every possibility of new affection, but this refusal wasn't simply about being unable to connect with new people, it was deliberate choice to reject potential sources of companionship, because accepting new relationships would require acknowledging that his marriage to Linda was permanently over, and that he needed to build new sources of emotional support and intimacy. The women who expressed interest in Paul during his post-divorce years weren't seeking his money or fame, but were genuinely attracted to someone whose public persona suggested warmth, humor, and life experience that might make him an interesting companion. Paul's rejection of these possibilities wasn't about high standards or loyalty to Linda, but about pathological inability to consider anyone else as worthy of his attention. Paul's destruction of professional opportunities that might have provided distraction from his obsession with Linda, someone whose entire identity had become organized around maintaining his role as rejected husband, rather than exploring other aspects of his personality and capabilities that might have supported productive activity and social connection. At gatherings with friends, no one ever saw Paul accompanied by anyone other than his son Chance Hogan, the only child from the marriage that had fallen apart, demonstrating how Paul's obsession with Linda was damaging even his relationship with his own son, who was forced to serve as Paul's only social companion, rather than being allowed to have a father who could model healthy approaches to relationships and personal development. The creative projects that Paul rejected during his obsessive period included opportunities to write about his experiences, participate in documentaries about Australian entertainment history, and collaborate with younger entertainers who admired his work and wanted to learn from his experience. All of these possibilities were dismissed because they would have required Paul to engage with present reality rather than remaining focused on impossible paths. Paul's refusal to travel or explore new environments was particularly destructive because it prevented him from gaining perspective on his situation and accessing experiences that might have provided alternative sources of meaning and connection. Instead of using his resources to explore the world or revisit meaningful places from his past, Paul chose to remain geographically trapped in the location most associated with his failed marriage. The family relationships that Paul damaged through his obsessive focus on Linda included not just son Chance, but also extended family members who might have provided emotional support and social connection if Paul had been psychologically available for relationships that weren't centered on his fixation with his ex-wife. The pain cut deeper when he realized Linda didn't care for them at all. She was absent from family gatherings, absent from calls from Australia. Only an old man's voice would answer. But Paul's response to this recognition wasn't to strengthen his relationships with people who did care about him, but to intensify his obsession with someone who had demonstrated complete indifference to his family connections and emotional needs. The therapeutic possibilities that Paul rejected included professional counseling that might have helped him process his divorce in healthier ways, support groups for divorced men facing similar challenges, and medical treatment for depression and anxiety that were obvious consequences of his obsessive behavior patterns. Paul's destruction of social connections extended beyond romantic possibilities to include friendships with people who had known him before Linda and might have helped him remember aspects of his identity that weren't dependent on his role as her husband. By isolating himself from longtime friends, Paul eliminated sources of perspective that might have challenged his obsessive thinking. The hobbies and interests that Paul abandoned during his obsessive period included activities that had previously provided him with satisfaction and accomplishment, independent of his relationship status. Rather than maintaining these sources of personal fulfillment, Paul chose to focus exclusively on activities that reinforced his connection to Linda and his hope for reunion. The community involvement that Paul rejected included opportunities to contribute his experience and resources to causes that might have provided meaning and purpose while connecting him with people who shared his values and interests. These possibilities were dismissed because they would have required Paul to develop identity and relationships that didn't center on his failed marriage. The most tragic aspect of Paul's destruction of new possibilities was that each rejection made future opportunities less likely and more difficult to access. By systematically eliminating alternatives to his obsession with Linda, Paul created a self-reinforcing cycle where isolation increased his dependence on impossible fantasies about reunion with someone who had explicitly chosen to exclude him from her new life. Chapter 6: The Cruelty of Self-Imposed Torture. Paul Hogan's daily existence in the years following his divorce from Linda Kozlowski became a masterclass in psychological self-torture, where every choice he made seemed designed to maximize his own suffering while maintaining his obsessive fixation on someone who had demonstrated complete indifference to his emotional state and explicit desire never to resume any form of relationship with him. Sometimes people caught sight of Paul quietly tearing old letters or smiling faintly at old photographs, simple moments that had become nothing more than memory. But these weren't healthy acts of reminiscence. They were compulsive behaviors that Paul used to inflict emotional pain on himself while feeding his delusions about the significance and permanence of feelings that Linda had clearly outgrown. The morning ritual of searching the horizon for Linda's return wasn't romantic devotion but deliberate psychological cruelty that Paul inflicted on himself by beginning each day with fresh disappointment and renewed confirmation that his most desperate hopes would continue to go unfulfilled. Rather than accepting this reality and adjusting his expectations, Paul chose to repeat this torture daily for years. I once had everything: fame, money, family, and a woman I loved. But in the end, I lost the most important thing. Paul reflected but this self-pity ignored his active role in creating and maintaining his own misery through choices that prioritized obsession over healing, fantasy over reality, and impossible hope over acceptance of circumstances that could have been adapted to support meaningful life. The preservation of Linda's belongings throughout their former home became a form of psychological waterboarding where Paul surrounded himself with constant reminders of her absence, while maintaining the fiction that these artifacts represented ongoing connection rather than evidence of abandonment. Each preserved item became a weapon he used against his own emotional stability. Paul's refusal to date or consider new romantic relationships wasn't noble fidelity but masochistic commitment to loneliness that served no constructive purpose except maintaining his identity as Linda's rejected husband rather than developing new aspects of his personality that might have supported different types of relationships and sources of satisfaction. Since parting ways with Linda, he has never opened his heart to anyone else. Brief relationships could not fill the void she left behind, but Paul actively prevented any relationship from having the opportunity to develop into meaningful connection by refusing to invest authentic emotional energy in anyone other than someone who had explicitly rejected him and chosen to build a new life with another person. The compulsive monitoring of Linda's life in Morocco through internet searches and social media wasn't caring attention but voyeuristic self-harm that Paul used to torture himself with evidence of her happiness while simultaneously convincing himself that her apparent contentment was temporary performance rather than authentic satisfaction with her choices. Meanwhile, far away in Morocco, Linda Kozlowski is living the life she had always dreamed of. Free and happy beside a man who loves her for who she truly is, not for the fame or image. But Paul's response to this information wasn't acceptance and good wishes for someone he claimed to love, but intensified obsession and elaborate theories about why her happiness couldn't be genuine or permanent. The financial resources that Paul devoted to maintaining his shrine to impossible dreams represented economic self-harm, where he chose to spend money on preserving delusions rather than investing in experiences or activities that might have provided actual satisfaction and meaning during his remaining years. Paul's rejection of professional opportunities, social connections, and creative projects wasn't protective of his privacy but destructive of his potential for continued growth and contribution. By systematically eliminating alternatives to his obsession with Linda, Paul ensured that his life would become increasingly narrow and meaningless. He felt lost looking at the wedding photos from Beverly Hills, the once happy videos now distant memory. But Paul's choice to repeatedly expose himself to these painful reminders wasn't accidental nostalgia but deliberate emotional self-harm disguised as romantic devotion to someone who had explicitly communicated her desire to end their relationship permanently. The conversations that Paul had with visitors about his marriage and divorce weren't seeking support or processing grief, but compulsive repetition of narratives that reinforced his obsession while preventing the acceptance and adaptation that might have allowed him to find peace with his actual circumstance. The physical health deterioration that accompanied Paul's psychological obsession wasn't accidental decline but consequence of systematic neglect of his own well-being in favor of maintaining focus on someone who had demonstrated complete indifference to his health, happiness, or survival. Paul once admitted that regardless of having everything, fame, wealth, and the admiration of millions, he still felt empty, especially without Linda by his side. But this emptiness was self-created through his refusal to invest in relationships, activities, or purposes that existed independent of his fixation on someone who would never return to fill the void he had created by rejecting all other sources of meaning and connection. Chapter 7: The Audience to His Own Madness. As Paul Hogan's obsession with Linda Kozlowski deepened into its second decade, he transformed from a private sufferer into someone who performed his mental illness for anyone willing to listen, turning his psychological breakdown into a one-man show that revealed the disturbing narcissism underlying his apparent devotion to someone who wanted nothing to do with him. Paul once confided in a rare interview with Australian, his eyes somber, his voice quiet, "I once had everything, fame, money, family, and a woman I loved. But in the end, I lost the most important thing." But this wasn't vulnerable honesty, it was calculated performance designed to generate sympathy while avoiding responsibility for the choices that had created and maintained his isolation. The interviews that Paul granted during his obsessive period weren't attempts to process his experiences or seek understanding, but opportunities to perform the role of tragic romantic hero who had been victimized by circumstances beyond his control rather than acknowledging his own responsibility for destroying his marriage through impossible expectations and possessive behavior. Paul's presentation of himself as Linda's devoted ex-husband ignored the reality that his post-divorce behavior had nothing to do with her well-being or happiness, and everything to do with maintaining his own identity as someone who had been wronged rather than someone who had failed to meet his partner's legitimate needs for independent and authentic relationship. I still think about her every day. Sometimes I wonder if I had changed a little, would she have stayed, Paul told reporters. But this wasn't genuine self-reflection. It was manipulation designed to suggest that Linda's departure was based on correctable flaws rather than fundamental incompatibilities that made their relationship unsustainable regardless of what changes Paul might have made. The public narrative Paul constructed about his marriage and divorce portrayed Linda as someone who had abandoned a loving husband rather than acknowledging that she had escaped from a relationship that had become psychologically suffocating and emotionally destructive for both parties involved. Paul's description of his daily routine and living situation wasn't honest reporting about his circumstances, but carefully crafted performance designed to generate pity while maintaining his delusion that his obsessive behavior represented romantic devotion rather than psychological dysfunction that harmed everyone touched. He lives quietly, staying away from the noise of Hollywood, only appearing in public occasionally. But Paul's withdrawal from public life wasn't dignified retirement or healthy privacy. It was isolation that allowed his obsession with Linda to flourish without reality testing or external challenge to his increasingly delusional thinking pattern. The sympathy that Paul received from journalists and fans who heard his stories about missing Linda reinforced his belief that his obsessive behavior was romantic rather than pathological, encouraging him to continue destructive patterns rather than seeking professional help or developing healthier approaches to processing his divorce. Paul's willingness to discuss his relationship with Linda for public consumption revealed the extent to which he had lost understanding of appropriate boundaries and personal dignity. Rather than processing his feelings privately or with appropriate therapeutic support, he chose to monetize his mental illness by performing it for entertainment value. The man who once made millions laugh through his comedy films was now left only with silence, an aging shadow and a wound in his heart that would never heal. But this poetic description ignored Paul's active role in maintaining his own suffering through choices that prioritized obsession over healing and fantasy over acceptance of reality. The letters to editors, social media posts, and informal comments that Paul made about Linda during chance encounters revealed someone whose entire conversation repertoire had become focused on analyzing a relationship that had ended years earlier, boring and concerning anyone who had to listen to his repetitive monologues about impossible love. Paul's transformation of legitimate grief about divorce into performance art demonstrated his fundamental inability to distinguish between authentic emotion and theatrical presentation. Having spent decades entertaining others, he had apparently lost the capacity for private, genuine emotional processing that might have led to actual healing. Recent images show an aging, lonely Paul Hogan, seemingly lost in memories of the past. But these images were often staged by Paul himself or taken during moments when he was deliberately positioning himself to appear tragic and romantic rather than seeking genuine privacy or anonymous healing from his psychological difficulties. The audience that Paul performed for during his obsessive period included not just journalists and fans, but also the imaginary Linda, who he believed might eventually see or hear about his public demonstrations of devotion and be moved to reconsider her decision to end their relationship permanently. The tragedy of Paul's performance of his own madness was that it prevented authentic healing while reinforcing the delusional thinking that kept him trapped in obsessive patterns. By turning his psychological breakdown into entertainment, Paul ensured that he would never receive the genuine support and professional intervention that might have helped him find peace and purpose in his actual circumstances. Chapter 8: The Price of Refusing Reality. As Paul Hogan entered his 10th year of obsessive fixation on Linda Kozlowski, the cumulative costs of his refusal to accept reality had destroyed not just his remaining relationships and creative potential, but his physical health, financial security, and psychological capacity for rational thought about any aspect of his life that wasn't directly related to his impossible fantasies about reunion with someone who had explicitly rejected him. Paul developed muscle atrophy. His arms weakened, his steps slowed, but the deepest pain was not physical, it was emotional. but this characterization minimized the extent to which Paul's emotional obsession had manifested in bodily symptoms that reflected the systematic self-neglect that characterized every aspect of his existence during his obsessive period. The medical professionals who treated Paul during his decline reported someone whose health problems were complicated by his refusal to engage with treatment recommendations that might interfere with his obsessive routine. Rather than prioritizing medical compliance that might have slowed his physical deterioration, Paul chose to maintain behaviors that supported his delusions about Linda while allowing his body to decay. Even with being a national icon of Australia with a fortune exceeding, Paul Hogan could not fill the void of loneliness within his heart, but this analysis ignored the reality that Paul's fortune was being systematically depleted by the costs of maintaining his obsessive lifestyle and his refusal to make practical decisions about downsizing or adapting his living situation to his actual needs and capability. The Venice Beach house that had become Paul's shrine to impossible dreams was consuming financial resources that could have supported comfortable retirement, travel experiences, or charitable contributions that might have provided meaning and purpose during his final years. Instead, Paul chose to pour money into preserving a domestic environment that served no function except feeding his delusions. The house now felt vast and empty, the sound of waves crashing against the shore, echoing fragments of memory, but Paul's choice to remain in this expensive and psychologically toxic environment represented financial and emotional masochism that served no constructive purpose except maintaining connection to locations associated with his failed marriage. The family relationships that Paul had sacrificed to maintain his obsession with Linda included not just his ongoing relationship with his son Chance, who was forced to witness his father's psychological deterioration, but also connections with other family members who had given up trying to provide support that Paul consistently rejected in favor of maintaining his fixation on someone who would never return. At gatherings with friends, no one ever saw Paul accompanied by anyone other than his son Chance Hogan. But even this relationship had become distorted by Paul's obsession, as Chance was forced to serve as audience for his father's repetitive monologues about Linda, rather than being allowed to develop normal father-son interactions that might have supported both of their emotional needs. Professional opportunities that Paul continued to reject during his obsessive period represented not just lost income, but missed chances to contribute his experience and knowledge to projects that might have honored his legacy while providing structure and purpose that could have supported healthier psychological functioning. Paul's refusal to engage with therapeutic resources that might have helped him process his divorce in healthier ways represented stubborn commitment to his mental illness rather than authentic devotion to Linda. Professional counseling might have helped him distinguish between love and obsession while developing strategies for building meaningful life independent of romantic relationships that no longer existed. The rare photo captured of Paul showed a hunched man with silver hair walking slowly along the beach at dusk, eyes drifting far across the endless ocean, revealing someone whose entire physical presence communicated defeat and resignation rather than the dignity and grace that might have characterized someone who had found peace with his circumstances and acceptance of life's changes. The social isolation that Paul maintained during his obsessive period wasn't protective of his privacy, but destructive of his mental health and cognitive functioning. Without regular interaction with people who might have challenged his delusional thinking or provided alternative perspectives on his situation, Paul created an echo chamber where his obsession could flourish He often spends late afternoons walking alone by the beach, a place where he and Linda once strolled together, laughing like the perfect couple. But now only he remains, facing the silence and an unending sense of regret, demonstrating how Paul had transformed potentially healing activities like beach walks into compulsive rituals that reinforced his obsession rather than supporting his recovery. The financial advisors and his planners who tried to help Paul make practical decisions about his resources during his decline reported someone who was incapable of rational planning because every decision was evaluated based on whether it might interfere with his impossible hopes for reunion with Linda, rather than practical considerations about his actual needs and circumstances. The price of Paul's decade-long refusal to accept reality was the complete waste of his remaining years on obsessive behavior that provided no satisfaction, created no value for himself or others, and prevented the personal growth and contribution that might have characterized a well-lived conclusion to an extraordinary life story. Most tragically, Paul's obsession with Linda prevented him from experiencing the peace, acceptance, and wisdom that might have been possible if he had been able to process his divorce as a normal life transition, rather than maintaining it as an ongoing emergency that consumed all his psychological resources and prevented adaptation to his changed circumstances. Epilogue: The Final Delusion. As Paul Hogan approaches the end of his life trapped in the Venice Beach house that has become both his prison and his shrine to impossible dreams, the final delusion of his obsession with Linda Kozlowski reveals itself in its most pathetic form. The belief that his decade of suffering has been somehow noble, romantic, or meaningful, rather than recognizing it as the waste of precious time and opportunities that it actually represents. Linda's departure left a void in him that nothing could ever replace, but this characterization ignores the reality that Paul actively prevented anything from replacing Linda by systematically destroying every opportunity for new relationships, creative project, or personal growth that might have filled that void with something authentic and sustainable rather than impossible fantasy. The narrative that Paul has constructed about his post-divorce years presents his obsessive behavior as evidence of true love, rather than acknowledging it as psychological dysfunction that harmed everyone it touched, including himself. His decade of waiting for someone who explicitly chose never to return wasn't romantic devotion, but cruel self-torture disguised as virtue. Since the day Linda left, Paul Hogan never opened his heart to anyone else. He accepted a life alone, but this wasn't acceptance, it was stubborn refusal to adapt to reality that prevented Paul from finding peace, purpose, or authentic connection during the final years of his life. The Venice Beach house where Paul continues to wait for Linda's impossible return stands as a monument to the destructive power of obsession and the human capacity for self-deception. Every preserved artifact of their failed marriage, every morning spent scanning the horizon for her figure, every evening spent talking to her absence represents time and energy that could have been invested in relationships and activities that actually existed, rather than fantasies that served no constructive purpose. I gave up an entire lifetime only to end up living like a shadow in my own home, Paul reflected. But this self-pity ignores his active role in creating his own shadowy existence, through choices that prioritized impossible hope over realistic adaptation to changed circumstance. The health problems that have ravaged Paul's body during his obsessive years reflect the physical cost of refusing to care for himself, while fixating on someone who demonstrated complete indifference to his well-being. His muscle atrophy, chronic pain, and progressive frailty are partly consequences of systematic self-neglect in service of maintaining connection to impossible dreams. Perhaps the price for blind love is not losing the one you loved, but losing yourself. But Paul's condition isn't the result of blind love. It's the consequence of transforming rejected romantic feelings into obsessive behavior that prevented authentic self-development and meaningful relationship with others who were actually available for connection. The son who has been forced to witness his father's decade-long psychological deterioration represents the most tragic casualty of Paul's obsession with Linda. Chance Hogan has been deprived of a father who could model healthy approaches to relationships, change, and personal growth, instead receiving only examples of how to become trapped in impossible fantasies that prevent authentic living. The financial resources that Paul continues to waste on maintaining his shrine to Linda could have supported charitable contributions, family assistance, or personal experiences that created actual value rather than feeding delusions that serve no constructive purpose for himself or anyone else. The professional legacy that Paul continues to neglect in favor of his obsession with Linda represents missed opportunities to contribute his experience and knowledge to projects that might have honored his achievements, while providing purpose and structure that could have supported healthy psychological functioning during his final years. Meanwhile, far away in Morocco, Linda Kozlowski is living the life she had always dreamed of, free and happy, demonstrating the ultimate futility of Paul's obsessive behavior. While he has spent a decade trapped in impossible fantasies about their relationship, Linda has built an authentic life of freedom and happiness that validates her choice to end their marriage and pursue opportunities that better served her actual needs and desire. The contrast between Linda's authentic happiness in Morocco and Paul's self-imposed misery in Venice Beach reveals the true nature of their relationship. Linda has moved forward to build meaningful connections and experiences, while Paul has remained frozen at the moment of their divorce, unable to accept reality or adapt to circumstances that could have supported different but equally valuable forms of satisfaction and purpose. As Paul's story approaches its inevitable conclusion, the final lesson of his obsession with Linda Kozlowski is not about the power of love or the tragedy of loss, but about the human capacity for self-destruction when we confuse possessive fixation with authentic caring, when we choose impossible fantasies over available reality, and when we allow rejected romantic feelings to consume the time and opportunities that could have been used for genuine growth, contribution, and connection with people who were actually willing and able to share our lives. The bridge worker who once connected separate places has spent his final years building walls that separated him from every form of authentic human connection, proving that obsession is not love but its opposite, a form of emotional terrorism that destroys everything it claims to protect, while serving no purpose except feeding the delusions of someone who has confused wanting someone with caring about their actual well-being and happiness.